Um, yes, so let's see. Hello, this is the second of 3 talks, and we'll once again look at some buildings I had on the Instagram. And as I said last time, these are buildings that I visited in the last 2 years when I've had this account, and then taking photos with my phone, and usually, on work trips, study trips, this sort of going through life and work. And in the first talk, we talked a lot about details and some particular elements of the buildings, and how we could perhaps gain a perspective by looking at them in these masterpieces, and also that would open up appreciation of many buildings that we have around us, that we can see the same engagement with particular choices. And today we look at some buildings that also have, of course, many great details and smaller situation, but they also have something else. We're going to look at some buildings from a slightly different perspective. So today, and this quote I chose for today, of course, is from this famous quote by Burnham about "make no little plans." And there are some buildings that have a certain, perhaps arresting quality that you can't really shake. Some buildings that you are fascinated by and sort of return to and can't really explain why they have something else than some other buildings. So there are some words like brilliant or confident that we'll see in a lot of these buildings, but mostly, while they are complex and have these intriguing details, they also have a certain tension, perhaps, in their overall composition and things like that. So I will share my screen and go into the buildings. So I think the first building I'm going to start with is actually coming a little later. I will make a little prologue first, you might say, and look at 2 Swedish buildings, 2 churches from about the same time in the south of Sweden. They are quite well known in Sweden, I think, from this period. They're both around the year 1700. This first one is a few decades before, and the other one is a few decades after. The first one is the Kalmar Cathedral in south of Sweden by Nicodemus Tessin the Elder, and the other one we're going to see is by his son, Nicodemus Tessin the Younger. So this first one, perhaps you've seen this building sometime also because the square in front of it has been remade and together with Kerosinian a few years ago, and was quite published around that time. And as often with these older buildings and these monuments, they have been, of course, been changed and restored back to some original state and so on. So it can sometimes be difficult to know what you see. But we're starting with this building, which is kind of a fascinating one. I mean, this is very rich. It's going in all kinds of directions. It has the sort of the corner towers. It's facing the square on the long side. It's a wonderful, joyous mix of all kinds of things. At the same time, the building is also, when you start to come a little closer and look at some of the parts, it has a lot of, I don't know what to call that, kind of, it's not rustic quality, but there is some provincial aspect, perhaps. This feels like very much a kind of a European church. If you only saw an image, you wouldn't perhaps know exactly where it was. It contains a lot of different parts from that period. And at the same time, if we go to the apse and to the back side, you see these forms, you see the pillars, everything is sort of charming and nice, and it has a wonderful space on the inside. But I think when we compare it to the other church, which is by Tessin the Younger, his son, you will also see a lot of the same elements. This is the Fredrik Church in Karlskrona from the first half of the 18th century. And here, of course, I think there are a lot of elements in this church where we can see some themes that we will go into today. And this is a kind of, you can sort of start to sense this sort of delightful and kind of particular strive for some sort of, it might be some sort of reduction or it might be some sort of refinement. But of course, this church in many ways is quite similar to the other ones, but it is so much more, you know, held together and restrained, I guess is the word. If you look at it from the different parts, I think, I mean, in its overall shape, in the partitions, and in the individual elements, you can see, of course, in the use of stone and the use of details, building techniques, it's not that far from the other one, but it has a particular quality of composition and reduction and a kind of brilliance. I think you will actually see it mostly from behind the apse. There is something about the pilasters, the overall, the sort of simpler shapes, while still keeping the forms, the orders, everything keeping together very tight. And there is something about a church or a building like this one, I think you will see it in relation to the other one, where you can sense that they have, it is perhaps the result of a slightly different process. This is brilliant on a different level. It's not as diverse in a sense. It is more concentrated, and I think some of the buildings we will go into today have this quality of this. It's somewhat severe, but it's also very playful in, I think, in one sense of the word. And the first building, the one I was actually intending to start with, is a masterpiece. It is the post office in Locarno by Livio Vacchini. It's from the early 90s. The project was from the late 80s, finished in the mid 90s. And it is a building that's part of the, it is like a block in the city. It sits on the corner of the famous square in Locarno. And when it has a very peculiar overall shape, with these piers and these reflecting elements. And as we will see when we go around the building, it has, it meets the different sides in a very rich and different way. So this is, to the right in this image, you have the big square, which is kind of a long and loosely shaped square. And here, on this side, there is a kind of arcade where the piers are hanging and these other freestanding elements form the kind of columns. And this is another view from that, slightly to the left. And you will see here, start to see a bit of a game of establishing an order and then confidently changing something in the order, heightening the overall sensation of it, always with a immaculate sense of proportion, scale, and a touch of urban drama, as it were in this case. So this is facing a sort of side square to the side of the big square, so it has a kind of a freer aspect. This is a view from the big square, seeing the building sort of in a shortened perspective. And here you can see that the piers aren't hanging; they are sort of landing on the square. From a street approaching the first facade we saw, we see this sort of colonnade being established, an arcade where you go under here and then you enter the post office. So this is a kind of representative arcade with this kind of colossal order. And then at the same time, you have this constant wonder about why this is exceptionally unique facade, I think, with the precision of the stones and this reflecting surface, and also the proportions. This is from a slightly longer perspective. And one of the interesting things is that if you go around the building, you will see that all the four different corners are quite different. So this is one of the corners on the arcade. You can see you're entering under the. It is a sort of a low arcade, but it's quite generously proportioned. On the complete opposite of the building, you have, or actually to the left from where the previous image was taken, you have a corner that serves as the entrance to an underground garage for the post doors. You will see here that one of the hanging piers is cut to give, of course, some greater heights for the vans approaching. But it's also something you will see in the other buildings I will also show by Vakini, where he really is the master of having, let's say, one curve or one deviation from the scheme, producing an incredible, powerful result. This is one of the facades. You will see on the left, you will see that sort of cut-off corner, and this is a facade towards the street. Here the piers land directly on the street or on the sidewalk. Yet again, a corner on the arcade. I mean, this isn't only about what's happening where you enter and exit the building, but it's also, of course, this incredible kaleidoscopic richness of form. This is another one of that street, and of the arcade. And then if we go to the slightly closer to the building, you will see this sort of stone elements, these metal, stone and metal. Here you can see a little bit of how they go together. So in the last talk, we saw a lot of things where you would have individual stones being put together in a particular way that rendered the reading of the process as very present. You can see, you can feel the presence in a lot of smaller parts of buildings and things like that. An incredible attention to detail and drama. On this building, everything is, of course, proportioned. Well, it's perfectly, worked out, but it's also perfectly proportioned in relation to the surroundings on each side. And there is something about devising that kind of system and having these differences within this extremely narrow range that you feel it produces a particular kind of tension that you can sort of sense when you're there, and also it sort of gets etched into your mind, so you can sort of constantly return to this in a very satisfying way. This, of course, is also a detail of where these piers land on the square. You can see the sort of raised slab forming a little, some steps, some places to sit perhaps along the square. A detail of that side where this is sort of covering the ramp going down, this colossal concrete element. You will see here also a little bit from the side, all the things sort of coming together, being kept apart, and having their sculptural form in a masterful way. On the inside, there are, this is the post office that you enter with these sort of yellow floors and this rich but kind of difficult to capture quality of reflecting surfaces, light and things like that. Everything is very well kept together. There are a few elements on the inside, such as this sort of where you can see this amazing rail being made by these folded steel plates together with the concrete of the stair. And of course, there is something like an element like this, which in some other buildings might have been overlooked, but here somehow it fits in its particular individualistic quality. It somehow fits perfectly into this exceptionally strict scheme. I think there are some other details you can. I guess it's almost impossible to have too much of this building. It's like from every angle you will see some new nuances here. Once again, that corner. So Vakini, another building not that far from here in Lugano. This is also in Ticino in Switzerland. I didn't say that at the beginning. This small apartment building of a few apartments only. It also has different aspects of the different sides. It's quite difficult to capture the overall shape of it in these tight surroundings. But there is a part of the building that you can get quite close to. On the one hand, this entrance, and then you will see here this very meticulously made concrete blocks going together with these steel details, forming not only these individual details, but also pointing to some more abstract quality and overall composition. I think you see it perhaps best at the on the side facing the water, where you will see these lower parts here of that apartment building, where you have the interlocking concrete elements, you have these sort of steel parts, you have the deep recesses, you have the voids, and everything is no particular detail is very unique in and of itself. You could take this part and you wouldn't really it wouldn't strike you as that particular if you saw it on its own. But of course, this has very much to do with establishing that overall system and then sort of going with it and against it in some particular ways. There are some other buildings of Vakini that do a similar thing, but I think those are perhaps some of the strongest buildings. For instance, this gymnasium is very severe. It has very strong elements, but I think there is a richness to the other buildings, perhaps due to their urban setting, different perspectives that bring out some other qualities. A final project by Vakini, which also I have to say is really one of those projects that once you've seen it, you can't really stop thinking about it, is this square in Bellinzona, also not that far from the other ones. This big, vast open square where you have the polished stone, square polished stone set in this seemingly random patterns, but there are also some rules of how they go together. But there is something also about the edge of the square, the slight variation in height, the individual elements of the stones coming together, playing with the scale of the square, but also of the. So I think in some way this brings into question a lot of the things we have in every square we see, and it's quite rare that someone would do something this radical on this vast scale. So those are the kinds of buildings that are quite strong and have, through very minor changes and delineations and relations, they produce these very strong sensations, I think. I will go from not that far away, of course. We have another very well-known masterpiece, La Conjunta by Peter Merkli, in a tiny village called Giornico. And here, I mean, this building is very well-known, but I think for me, having seen the building, or once I visited the building and felt in relation to the site, it felt very much like that there was something about the overall form, the building volumes, the different ways they come together and they form this sort of linear structure relating to this, you know, big landscape, but at the same time being very, I don't know what to call that, self-possessed, is that the word, or restrained? There are a lot of particularities in this that of course goes towards the way he has put together the building, both on the inside and on the outside. It's a sequence of rooms containing sculptures by Hans Josefsson. The sculptures themselves are quite amazing, how we relate to them in these different rooms. But I think they're also, this is the kind of building, a very rare building, where you can feel like every material on every surface, every floor, every corner, this how they go together, these sort of formwork details, establishing here they go together, at some other corner they will meet perfectly. You never really feel like you can see the system, or you can see elements of the system, or a system, or perhaps just a sense of a system. At the same time, you're in I'm guessing some kind of a masterly kept together overall scheme, producing these different rich interlocking sequences of sensations. I thought it was interesting to make some almost visual connections between these buildings and their particular forms and treatments of the materials. Of course, we have this sort of concrete subdivisions. And then if we jump quickly back to Sweden, we will we can sense some relationship here, perhaps, on establishing a sort of a very restrained form. In this case, the famous mausoleums by Asplund and Leverens that are standing next to each other at the Northern Cemetery in Stockholm, outside Stockholm. I think it's interesting to see here that the Leverens one, which had a complicated history, but ended up as a very sort of unified block. It has some particularities, of course, but I think it's perhaps more interesting to look at the Asplund one next to it, where you will feel like here Asplund has sort of kept the strong form, but he has entered so many lines, so many parts, so many things coming together, and this almost imperceptible corner pilasters here, that you feel like there is a kind of a tension there, a kind of a force emanating from the building that no particular element can perhaps explain. There are other elements of this. I mean, of course, you can't enter these buildings. There are graves. But I think you can relate, perhaps you will find a way to come closer to them by relating them to each other and also to the other forms. Of course, Asplund knew very well how to use ornament when he wanted to do so. So every part being embellished or not is part of that great scheme. And of course, this building is only 20 square meters or something like that. It's also very close to some other graves that Asplund also did, which are perhaps interesting to make a quick detour to. Just below, we will find a wonderful grave that Asplund did for a royal prince, actually, or a prince from the royal family. This is one of the. This is almost the opposite of the other one. It doesn't have the overall geometric forms, but it has a very dense and well put together, rich atmospheric concentration. These columns are only 2 meters high, 2.10 perhaps, something like that. And yet you have this you know, I don't know, atmospheric is perhaps not the word, but they are very evocative, these elements. Of course, a lot of details, and one of the most amazing one, of course, is the actual door into the, presumably, tomb, which is made by, or cut in stone, with this, all the elements of the door are present, but they're made in stone. There are also aspects of so the previous projects in another grave that Asplund did at the Royal Cemetery, or the Northern Cemetery, for a the family of a soldier who was lost at sea, I think. This is interesting because it somehow has a lot of the same elements as the other one, and yet it doesn't come together as unified as the other ones. At first, I felt that it was very difficult to relate to this project, but perhaps due to that nature, I have thought a lot about it afterwards. There is something about it's also very strange. It's sort of put into a sort of fake rock here made by concrete. But there is something about the elaboration of the capitals, the severity of this sort of top-heavy shape that doesn't really go together. And I guess it is somehow because of Asplund, you do feel that it's relevant to continue looking at it. The details, to talk a little bit more about details, are of course very, very nice, very free and very particular. But I will go from these smaller ones to something that's perhaps more well known to where we are having the lecture, so to say, in London. These are the extensions to the Central Criminal Court in London by McMorran Whitby from the 60s and 70s, or 60s, perhaps you can say. And this is one of those projects that I sort of came across this coincidentally, perhaps 15 years ago when I was in London. I didn't know anything about it. I was sort of stopped in my tracks, and then I didn't catch much information at the time. I only remember the location and the name of the building, and then later there has been a little bit more information sort of coming out. And this is on a trip last year, revisiting of this fantastic, enormous building, and I mean, this is one of those buildings that has, it's almost incomprehensible to understand how anyone would extend a building in this particular way. At the same time, we have all these elements that we can sort of relate to, these sort of window shapes, the arches, these sort of hanging or semi-cantilevering piers, And at the same time, there is this absolute mastery of these forms. It's impossible to go inside due to security. I've tried twice now. I'm probably never getting in, I'm guessing. But I think there is, this is a sort of a street view. These are the kinds of, I think this also goes a little bit to the Vakini buildings, where you have some elements. It's not really individual stone. It has more to do with some sort of plastic or sculptural capability of making a sort of free composition and charging the elements with some kind of unique quality that isn't it's not unrelatable. It's not, it doesn't shout so much, but once you start looking at it, it sort of gets into your head and you can't really sort of get it out. And I think this, the lower parts of this especially are a kind of, it's something that almost changes the way you look at a lot of sort of received forms that we have known from so many other places. So there is something just about this facade and these elements that is one of those, I think one of those buildings that sort of gets into your head and then you can't stop going back to it. You can sort of enter through a little passageway to come to there's a kind of a open courtyard situation. There are these elements then somehow grow into also working as a, I don't know, almost, it's not domestic perhaps, but it's a very different kind from that, you know, severe colossal order of that other facade. They work very well here as well, these forms and these, but they do on this side have a slight more, less perhaps power. So I think that might show a little bit the peculiarity of that street facade, that there is something about that is accomplished on a sort of a ground level, the level of the building, or perhaps the level of the street or the city, that the individual elements can't really explain. This is, of course, it's a joy to go through that little passage and discover this on the inside. So that is one building that, of course, has sort of etched itself into my mind. I'm going to have to do a little more scrolling now, because it's the next building is sort of, well, I will make a quick stop here. This is more, as we talked last time, a bit more about almost the details of buildings, but this is sort of slightly bigger. It is part of a building in Lund. It's a bank building by Carl Bergsten. It's the overall form or shape of the building is a little peculiar, sort of put together in a different way. Quite interesting, but perhaps not. Well, in contrast to the overall building, I found this, ever since I found this corner, and this particularly this sort of sculpture of this eagle, and how these vaults or arches come together on this column, I found this part of that building very, very intriguing and interesting, and I have been sort of returning to this very much since I found it. So this is one of those where you can see here how these sort of grand forms, land in this sort of half. It's a little bit like it's a stone vault and a brick vault sort of merging together or colliding in different ways. And this has less to do, I think, with the individual stones that are part of this one, and more to do with the forms or sort of spaces created, and how they sort of blend together. But the building I wanted to go into, which I really found extremely fascinating. I don't know if it's one of the buildings I've thought the most about, perhaps in the last years, sort of since starting this project. It's a building outside of Milan. It's a church. There are a lot of churches today for some reason, I don't know. But this is called Santa Barbara. It's by Mario Bacciocchi. It's outside of Milan from 1954, and this has this kind of elemental building shape with the pitch roof and the volume. But there is something about the wonderful obsessive quality of this partition and these sort of soft colors. They're very difficult to capture in photos, perhaps, but there is this. There's a connection, perhaps, between the Bikini building and something like this, because there are a lot of buildings where you can see, and of course nowadays we see a lot of grids, we see a lot of order buildings and so on, but there are very few buildings, at least very few order buildings that both have the sort of the grid and the order, and then at the same time retain some sort of tension or some sort of power or some unresolved quality of a system being made up by these sort of particular ways the parts have been put together that create both a kind of overall order, but at the same time establishes that kind of forceful quality emanating also almost from the and this building has that quality, whatever that quality could be. I think in all parts, it's a exceptionally rich facade made up of very, very simple elements. I don't know if you've seen this building before or if you visited it. It's quite unremarkable surroundings, but there are very few buildings I think I've come across in the last years that have made a stronger impact than this one. So in that sense, I think this goes into the sort of the theme of this day. I can show some images from the interior, which is very nice, but it's not as it doesn't have the same charge as the exterior, perhaps. But it's this is the ceiling. It's a very well put together project, but it's, I think, mostly on the exterior. I found that absolutely fascinating. And then we will finish up with one of the, of course, most well-known and most exceptional masterpieces, I think, of the last let's say decades. So it's another project by Alvaro Siza. This is the church in Marco de Canaveses. This is a project that I felt instantly from the first time I saw it. There was something about this project that that sort of related and had something. But it wasn't really until I visited it last year where I could realized that it one of those rare buildings that has that quality on so many levels. I mean, this facade is the most famous sort of Baroque feeling, and but it's also on the rear facade on the with the door and this peculiar, intricate double tower arrangement. This is one of those buildings that has super strong exterior form, masterfully made. It's showing itself quite differently from different. I mean, the surroundings are. It's a nice location, but it's kind of unremarkable surroundings. Establishes these squares around it. But I think there is something. I think the overall qualities of the building are really to be found in some combination between this amazing exterior form and then on the interior. And of course, it relates to so in the last talk about from Caesar, who is a master of those kind of choices and work together on so many levels. So here we see the situation and the sort of side views to the door. When the door opens, this door, they just open it just as I came. We see here a little step. We see this door. Yes, and here are on the exterior there are these other steps and stairs when these you have these rich stones. But I think it's really on the interior. This has the kind of a masterful sense of space and use of individual elements that come together in a way that I find almost impossible to sort of disentangle or pull together. So everything sort of goes into each other, and more than the individual stone, this is some kind of this is some kind of combination of establishing spaces, orders, different elements. I mean, there are so many things here where you can see the individual complexities of corners, materials coming together, opening up, seeing through, and so on. So this very elemental, and then after a while, it really, there are so many things like that to see. And then at some other level, you're sort of almost forgetting some very basic elements, like these sort of double towers that also had this little baptismal thing under it. And then when you come there, you see back onto that little entrance, and these kinds of, this is a little bit like, I can't really say if this is the same, you know, kind of project in a sense as the Vakini projects, or if it's a completely different one, but it's somehow, it has this kind of a brilliance about it, like every part goes together in a very, and when I mean part, I don't mean the individual stones, but more the different parts of the project. They come together in a sort of almost perfect way, and at the same time, it's very strange the way they come together. So there is something about that freedom that I guess the theme for today is our buildings that somehow have a difficult to catch quality that you can't really. You're sort of never finished with them. You can sort of return to them, and you can become familiar with them, but they can't really be resolved. So there is something on that theme, and that is, I guess, what we could call a ever-growing insistency from the title. and there is this quality of buildings that that have that yes, particular quality. I think we'll end there and open up for some questions.
Samuel, thank you. That was sensational. We've got a few questions coming in already. I'm going to unmute James Payne, who's James, over to you.
Hi, Samuel. Thank you.
Hello.
Fantastic lecture, and really, really great to be reminded of those links between Scandinavia and the north and the south and Italy and about classicism. I was just wondering, I mean, I think that Ros Diamond is here. So I'm hoping to kind of tempt her out to turn on a video and join in this discussion. But I was just wondering if you're aware of the research of Lutz Mancia on the photographs of Sigurd Leverance from his journeys to Italy, which are in this amazing book, which is the 9H on continuity. But what's interesting is that from his visits to Florence, the Palazzo Pitti, or to Pompeii, he would take photographs, quite close-up photographs of details or tombstones and materials, and I think Lewis Mancia's research goes to show that there is a definite link between that sensibility of how he would take a photograph and his work. And I know that Sigurd Leverance is not on Instagram, although apparently someone is claiming to be him, but he's obviously not because he's dead. But it's just, I suppose my question is, yeah, it's more about that kind of sensibility which you can get from taking a photograph, and how that feeds into your own kind of life world of, you know, ideas and your own work.
Yes, I think there is. I guess I think there is something about. I mean, there is something about photographs. I think what you see when you have the photographs like this on the Instagram, there are, let's say, for whatever reason, there are some that you can sort of also, not just the buildings, but the particular photographs, they can sort of, you can return to, and in those photographs, even of your own photographs, you can sort of, or someone else's, you can sort of continue finding elements. I mean, it could be something about the buildings, but it could also be something about the photograph, perhaps. That there is, I think, the overall, I don't know what to call that, project of putting the buildings like that on Instagram, as part, like the buildings we're discussing now. I think there is some overall evolution of how to see, how to relate to buildings by taking the pictures and also, you know, pointing them, discussing them with others, and sort of sharing them. In that sense, it's open to interpretation, but it also sort of, they build on each other, I guess. So there is something like, of course, some photograph that you know, it's a classic that perhaps those kinds of photographs that Leverance would take, I mean, they would end up, of course, in the studio or somewhere else where they can have a sort of life on their own. And nowadays we have so many images, of course, and so on. So sometimes perhaps the power of each photograph is a little diluted, and perhaps also there is some confusion. You don't really get into those images that you could perhaps do easier before, when there were not that many of them. But I do find that there is a kind of there is something to be taught by taking the pictures and looking at them and discussing them, that for sure influences, I think, a lot on how to look at architecture. I mean, I also, of course, look at architecture through the lens of, you know, practice, and being a sort of practicing architect, and knowing a lot about how, you know, projects evolve and the kind of decisions you make and so on. And that's not really only to see, you know, they could do that instead, and some other project they couldn't do that. But on a very basic level, I think you get very close to the sort of presence of the buildings and the process, and there is some relation there that you can have for yourself, both when you're visiting the buildings, but I think also when you're taking the photographs. There is something about, you know, freezing that aspect and putting it up and so of course taking a photograph and you know choosing it for that to be seen is of course one way of, you know, whether it's I wouldn't use the word framing, but it's one way of sort of putting it together, the things that are there but also in the image. So I think I haven't thought so much about how to, you know, verbally you know define that, but I do feel that there is a great strength in the relating to buildings through photographs. So I do find it's kind of influences an overall view on architecture, I think. And of course, I think you said something earlier, Alice, also about that there are some elements that are perhaps very difficult to discuss in some other way. I mean, I do find that there are, if you just take some parts and look at them and look at these photographs, for instance, you can ask how could you sort of reduce that to a line or two or one image or something like that, when actually, you know, 5 images of almost the same thing reveals so much more. So there is yes, I guess I interpreted the question a little bit about the sort of the project of taking and relating to photographs of buildings, and I do find it is a rich and rewarding thing to do, and I think it's a kind of interesting now that we have. I mean, of course, the Leverance photographs were in a sort of drawer for a long time, and then we could realize some things from them. And now, of course, it's very possible to see a lot of things, even now when we are confined to our, you know, houses and so on. So I think there is it's very nice. But I must look at that book also.
I'm struck that this way of looking, I think it extends beyond earlier than photography, and this way that architects would have worked in the past of sketching buildings in a very instrumental way and making records of details. You know, one looks at Michelangelo's sketchbooks, and he's similarly honing in on a molding with a view to taking it apart from the system to which it belongs and looking at it as something that you can manipulate and adjust and reinvent. And you know, these extraordinary sheets where a molding is subjected to you know, all of the parts of the system are, the proportions of a system are kind of the classical system are kind of retained, but each individual molding is subjected to a kind of significant manipulation. But I mean, that it's interesting that the way that architects used to work of looking at the world and sketching seems to have been translated now into photography. Do you see it as an analogous process?
Yes, I do think that it's true, and I think there is. Yeah, I mean, in some way, perhaps it is a sort of an ancient way of actually relating to the sort of being present at a building and having a particular perspective that, you know, it's easy to see how that could have sort of become a bit lost in the process, not just, you know, whether it's, you know, fashionable to sketch or not, but of course, I mean, the way architecture and the building industry and societies have evolved in the last 50 years, everything is very, you know, based on systems and very fast and very, you know, technical and so on. So mastering those systems is of course very much a part of what we do, but and I'm guessing for many people and for a long time it was more a thing you would do perhaps on the side looking at some buildings, whereas in your work you would be more into this sort of schemes and systems. And I think perhaps now it's more of it's very much available. We have it all the time, of course, in the phones, on the screens and so on. So I mean, it can be, I think, a very natural or easy way access, in a sense, of both as a basis for conversations and also development of work, not just in academic settings but also in practice. And perhaps you're correct there. There is interesting connection there to the ways you were sort of taught architecture before by going to Rome, perhaps, if you were privileged. Like, for instance, in the first two buildings I showed, of course, one of the things that happened there between the two wasn't only father and son, but also the father became, Tessin the elder, he became very established, and then of course his son was sent to Rome on a scholarship from I guess from the king, and then he was there for many years, and then he came back and had this sort of experience and amazing thing to draw on then when he did his other and that's more open to everyone now, which it's a fantastic element of this part of our everyday both practice and interests now. Of course, perhaps we will not leave as beautiful artifacts for the future as you did.
Samuel, we have a question from Rachel Ho, who does not have a microphone, so I'm going to read it.
Yeah.
I think these are all really powerful details that we admire as architects, but could Samuel comment on how he feels these details affect the experience of visitors who don't see buildings from the eyes of architects? I mean, in a way, I was put in mind of when you were speaking of a quote from Summerson, John Summerson, about his definition of a successful facade being a continuously related set of inventions, which I've always thought is a pretty good definition of what I'm looking for in architecture. But it does suggest a sort of an ability to read buildings like a language. And I think maybe what Rachel's question's implying is that isn't how the untutored eye necessarily accepts architecture or deals with architecture.
Yes. Yes, I think so. I don't know. So the question was a bit about whether you become sort of informed in how you see by being trained as or being knowledgeable about how architecture is made, you can say. Yes, I don't know if it's a correct analogy, but I remember at some point I studied some what we call, I don't know what that's called, but film science, the study of cinema. And then one of the first lecturers, one of the lecturers said that, a lot of people, they're very afraid to study this element because they feel like the magic of the cinema is going to get lost when you know all the tricks, So learning about the different ways you make a scene or make a movie and so on. And I really found it was the opposite in many ways. I mean, knowing a little bit more about how the things are being made sort of brought out a lot of richness, and also, of course, some identification with the way that you can sort of realize what was a kind of not that interesting, just a condition, and what was perhaps intent, and what was some happy coincidence, and what was some strike of genius when you knew a bit more about how people actually do them. And I guess there is something about that. Looking at the buildings, it's not just going out and just looking around and seeing something. Of course, it's seeing something that is part of that sort of system of thoughts and elements and knowledge. So yes.
I mean, it relates to, I'm reminded of a comment, I think last night we were both watching Jaume Mayol from TEDA speaking, and he was talking about the Jorn Utzon house in Mallorca, where he was saying that he felt, that an architect or a farmer who would encounter this house would both recognize it as a great work of architecture and a good environment to be in. The quality of the building was immediately legible to an eye, whether trained or otherwise. And yeah, I guess there's maybe one of the implications of Rachel's question is perhaps that is there anxiety that the kind of nuance that you've been describing in these talks is something that is not legible it requires a certain education for it to be detectable?
It's probably true in some sense, but it's not. Doesn't have to be sort of discouraging, because I find it. I mean, I think in all kinds of cultural contexts, having a discussion about something is always a kind of education in a sense. So I think, and I feel very much things like your own project here and other means that we have nowadays of connecting. I think that's always valuable, because it's a little bit like, even if you didn't know so much about it before, once you start getting into it, there are a lot of elements and parts that are really, really rich. And I think it's, I think we all, I mean, the only thing that is a little bit difficult when you're not, let's say, trained or already inside, in a sense, in that conversation, is of course where to look. I mean, if you, and then that's a great part of having conversations, or I mean that can sort of point the way. If you go that way and look at those things, it's going to be it's a little bit like having the locals give you a hint of where to go, like where are the good spots or something like that. So in that sense, those that are already, let's say, a little bit inside the conversation, they can sort of guide other ones coming in. But there is nothing inherently sort of difficult to reach, or difficult to, or impossible to gain. I find it's very much but of course there are a lot of elements of architectural discourse that are let's say difficult to follow if you haven't sort of followed the line coming up to that discourse, whether it's in academic situations, or a particular controversial discussion that has been going on so long, so everyone knows some things. So I do find it, I mean, it's quite relatable, I think, but it's I mean, I think we will all. It's always great when we find ways to connect, perhaps the architect and the farmer, or perhaps architects from different backgrounds, or people that are interested in the field from different perspectives. It can. I think it's very rewarding to develop those conversations, and I do find that, or think that. Everyone is open to sort of grow and learn more and see more, and it's a sort of infinite richness out there. So it's there's no it's not possible to see everything or know everything. It's always more to find.
Samuel, would you quickly say something about the final talk that you're going to give?
Yes. So I chose some quotes for different parts, and for the next one. I chose the quote, evokes many levels of meaning and combinations of focus. It's from the Introduction to Complexity and Contradiction by Venturi. And I think it's going to be a little bit more about, yes, a kind of complexity, a kind of interesting, perhaps more than individual parts being developed and overall, you know, as in the first one, this sort of overall characters almost that we've seen in some of the projects. This time, I think it will see a bit more about the relation between different parts and how they can be, you know, what you can sort of get and gain from those complex, you know, relationships, and that is also something that can gain a incredible richness and tension and joy. So I think that's going to be where we end up.